Clara Reed pressed her wedding ring against the cold glass and told herself she would not cry. Not again. Not tonight. She had been a wife for 11 months, and not once had her husband spoken her name like it mattered. She had loved him in silence, in service, in every small act of devotion he never noticed. And tonight, standing alone at that parlor window, while the summer storm tore through Virginia, she finally made a decision that would change both their lives forever. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel, follow it all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The storm came in fast off the Blue Ridge, the way summer storms always did in Virginia, without warning, without apology, like something long overdue, finally arriving. Clara Reed heard it, hit the roof of Reed Hollow before she saw it, heard the first hard crack of thunder roll across the fields her father had signed away to pay his debts, the same fields that had made her a bride at 22, and a ghost by 23. She was standing at the parlor window when the door opened behind her. She did not turn around. She knew his footsteps. She had memorized them the way a woman memorizes the sound of a door that never fully opens, measured, controlled, slightly slowed when he was tired from the fields. Nathaniel Reed moved through his own house like a man who had already decided where everything belonged, and Clara had long since understood that she belonged somewhere near the furniture. Present, useful, unremarkable. "You missed supper," he said. His voice was not unkind. It never was. That was the cruelest part of it. Clara kept her eyes on the storm. Rain was beating the garden flat, bending the tall grasses along the fence line, turning the dirt lane to mud. She watched a lantern blow out in the yard and felt something similar happen inside her chest. "I wasn't hungry," she said. Mrs. Harlan held a plate. Then Mrs. Harlan was kind. A pause. She could feel him standing in the middle of the room, still damp from whatever he'd been doing out in the fields before the storm broke, waiting for her to turn around, the way a man waits for a clock to chime, not with desire, but with expectation. "Clara? I thought hunger would be easier to bear than being watched like a mistake," she said. The words came out quieter than she'd intended, not bitter, just honest. And maybe that was worse because Nathaniel didn't know what to do with her honesty any more than he knew what to do with her presence. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Are you unwell?" She almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because after 11 months that was still the question. Not "what do you need," or "I'm sorry," or even "I see you standing there and I know you are suffering." Just the practical inquiry of a man managing his household. "Are you unwell?" "No," she said. "I am perfectly fine." It was the most complete lie she had ever told. Nathaniel Reed had married Clara Whitaker on the 14th of June, 1815, in a small ceremony at the Baptist Church outside Harrisonburg, Virginia, with 37 guests and a sky so blue it felt like mockery. He had married her because her father, Thomas Whitaker, owed a debt that only land could settle, and the parcel of bottomland along the creek south of Reed Hollow was worth more than Thomas Whitaker's dignity. The deal was simple. Nathaniel took the land. Thomas kept his name. Clara became a bride. She had known it going in. Her father had not lied to her to his credit. He had sat her down in the kitchen 3 weeks before the wedding and said, "Nathaniel Reed is a cold man, but he is not a cruel one. You will be provided for. You will have a good house and a respected name." Clara had looked at her father's hands, the hands that had once lifted her onto horses and built her a small writing desk for her 8th birthday, and read scripture aloud every Sunday morning without fail, and she had understood that those hands were tired, that he was tired, that she was the only thing left he could offer to save what remained of the family name. "All right, Papa," she had said. She had not said "I love you." She had not said "I'm frightened." She had not said "please don't do this." She had simply folded her hands in her lap and made peace with the fact that some doors, once they close behind you, do not open again. What she had not been prepared for was the particular quality of Nathaniel's indifference. It was not anger. It was not contempt. It was something more precise and more devastating than either. It was absence. He was present in the house every day, ate at the same table, slept 2 rooms down the hall, and still managed to make Clara feel as though she were living alone. He spoke to her when necessary. He answered her questions. He thanked her when she managed the household well and said nothing when she didn't. He was by every outward measure a perfectly adequate husband, and she was dying of it. Abigail Reed found her in the garden the next morning, 2 days after the storm, crouching in the mud between the bean rows, pulling weeds with more force than the weeds probably deserved. "You'll ruin your gloves," Abigail said. "They're already ruined." Abigail was 26, 3 years younger than Nathaniel, and about 3 decades sharper. She had her brother's dark eyes and none of his restraint, which meant she said the things Clara was still learning to think. She settled herself on the low fence and watched Clara work. "Margaret Holt was at the mill yesterday," Abigail said, with the particular tone of a woman who has information she has not yet decided whether to share. Clara kept pulling weeds. "She said something," Abigail continued. "She always says something. She said Nathaniel married you to get clear title to the creek land and that everyone in the county knows it. She said it loud enough that 4 other women heard." Clara's hands stilled in the dirt. She had known the gossip existed. She had felt it at church, had seen it in the way certain women smiled at her with their mouths and not their eyes, had overheard the word arrangement used more than once in conversations that went quiet when she approached. But hearing it spoken plainly out loud in Abigail's voice, that made it real in a different way. "What did you say to her?" Clara asked. "I told her that she married the Holt boy for his father's mill, and a new bonnet, and that perhaps she ought to be more careful about which stone she picks up to throw." Abigail paused. She did not appreciate that. Clara looked up. Something in her chest cracked open just slightly, not from pain this time, but from gratitude so sharp it nearly hurt. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. It's just the truth." Abigail studied her for a moment. "Clara, does my brother speak to you at all?" "He speaks to me." "That is not what I asked." Clara pulled another weed. "He tells me when supper has been missed. He asks if I'm unwell. He mentions when the tenant farmers need something from the house stores." She paused. "We are very efficient with one another." Abigail was quiet for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "He wasn't always like this." "I know. After Eleanor died after the baby." "Abigail." Clara's voice was gentle but firm. "I know. And I am sorry for what he lost. I truly am. But sorrow does not excuse a man from seeing the woman who is standing right in front of him. It does not give him permission to let her disappear." Abigail had no answer for that. Neither did anyone else. Mrs. Harlan had worked at Reed Hollow for 19 years. She had seen 2 masters, one mistress, a stillborn child, a grief that had turned the whole house gray, and now a young wife who moved through the rooms like a woman learning to breathe underwater. Mrs. Harlan was not a sentimental woman, but she was an observant one, and what she observed over the first months of Clara Reed's marriage was this: the girl was drowning, and nobody in the house was reaching in. She started leaving small things. A cup of chamomile on Clara's writing desk when the house was quiet. A note tucked into the week's household accounts with a line of genuine praise. "The Birch Tennant family spoke very well of your visit. Ma'am thought you ought to know." A warm shawl placed over the back of the parlor chair where Clara sat reading on the evenings Nathaniel was in his study. Small things. Nothing that required acknowledgement. Just evidence that someone noticed she was there. Clara noticed. One afternoon in late July, she came into the kitchen and found Mrs. Harlan teaching young Della, the 13-year-old girl who helped with the wash, to sound out letters in an old almanac. Mrs. Harlan looked up without embarrassment. "She's sharp as a tack," she said. "Shame to leave that to chance." Clara sat down at the kitchen table without being asked. "Can I help?" Mrs. Harlan moved the almanac between them. And that was the beginning of something. Elias Carter came to Harrisonburg in the spring of 1816. hired by the county to serve as schoolmaster for the boys of the district, and incidentally as clerk for whatever civic business required a man who could write a clean sentence. He was 29, lean, quietly humorous, with the kind of face that people trusted without quite knowing why. He had served in the militia during the war, carried a slight stiffness in his left shoulder from a wound he never talked about, and possessed the rarest quality Clara had encountered in a man of that place and time. He listened when a woman spoke. He met Clara at a church gathering in late June, when the summer was already bearing down on Virginia, like a hand pressing flat on a chest. The women had organized a collection of goods for a tenant family whose barn had burned, and Clara was managing the sorting, which put her in the center of the activity in a way she was still unaccustomed to after months of being peripheral. Elias had come to deliver a crate of goods on behalf of the county office. He set it down at the table, straightened, and said, "You're Mrs. Reed, I reckon. I've heard you've been doing good work out among the tenant families." Clara looked up mildly startled. "I do what I can. The Miller children told my pupil James that a lady came to read to them when their mother was sick," he said. "Said she read them a whole chapter of Robinson Crusoe, and then helped their father mend the fence before she left." He tilted his head slightly. "That you—" "Someone had to mend the fence," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And then he smiled. Not the polished, performing smile she had grown accustomed to in county society, but something simpler and more genuine, the smile of a man who has just heard something that genuinely pleased him. "Yes, ma'am, someone did." It was a small exchange, nothing more than two polite people speaking briefly at a church table. But Clara thought about it that evening, sitting alone in the parlor with her sewing, while Nathaniel worked in his study, and she could not immediately explain why. She thought about it the way you think about something you didn't expect to need. The way sunlight feels different when you've been inside too long. She tried. For 11 months she had tried. She had learned the names of every tenant family on Reed land, their children, their ailments, their debts, and their small dignities. She had managed the house with the careful attention of a woman who understood that this was the only territory allotted to her. She had sat across from Nathaniel at the supper table every evening and tried to find a way into conversation, some thread she could pull that might open him up even slightly. "The Birch boys were fixing the north fence today," she had said one evening in March. He had said. "The elder one, Thomas, said the creek has been rising. He thinks the spring thaw was heavier than usual. I'll look at it. He also said his wife just had another baby, a girl. They named her Hannah." A pause. "That's good?" He seemed proud. He ought to be. And then the silence had come back in the way it always did, like water filling a space, and Clara had excused herself before the meal was finished, and gone upstairs, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and pressed her hands flat against her knees, and breathed until the tightness in her throat eased. She had not cried. She had decided sometime in April that she would not cry anymore. Not because the pain had lessened, but because the tears were not solving anything. They were not opening Nathaniel's door, or loosening the cold knot at the center of their marriage, or giving her back the years she was spending in this beautiful hollow house. They were just evidence of a suffering that no one was watching, and Clara had begun to feel that her suffering deserved at least a witness, even if that witness was only herself. So she stopped crying, and she started doing. She went to the tenant families on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, taking whatever the house stores could spare, and sometimes what they couldn't. She organized a small lending of Nathaniel's agricultural almanacs to the farmers who could read, and asked Mrs. Harlan to compile a list of which families had children who could not. She wrote letters to the county minister about establishing a small school on the estate's eastern corner, where an old tobacco barn sat unused. She did not ask Nathaniel's permission. She did not consult him. She simply moved through her days with a quiet, gathering determination, and if he noticed, he said nothing. In July, at the Midsummer Social, held at the Graves family's large farm, east of town, Nathaniel danced with 3 women and spoke with Clara twice, once to tell her that Abigail needed help with her shawl, and once to inform her that the carriage would be ready at 9. Clara stood at the edge of the dancing with a cup of cider growing warm in her hands and watched her husband move easily through the room, laughing at something Hector Graves said, bowing slightly to Mrs. Pemberton, perfectly at ease in every social exchange, except the one that required him to cross the room and stand beside his wife. Elias Carter found her before she found an excuse to leave. "You look like a woman counting the hours," he said. "I'm counting the dancers," she said. "It passes the time." He came to stand beside her at the edge of the room, not too close the proper distance, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then he said, "I've been meaning to ask. About the school." She turned slightly. "What school?" "The one you've been quietly planning for 3 months." He said with that simple, direct honesty that she was learning was just the way he spoke. "I heard you spoke to Reverend Mills. I heard you've been talking to the Harlan woman about which children need it most." He paused. "I teach school, Mrs. Reed. If you are building one, I might be of use." Clara stared at him. "You would help," she said. "I reckon that's what schoolmasters are for," he said. She looked away across the room to where Nathaniel was refilling his cup and saying something that made Hector Graves laugh again. Then she looked back at Elias Carter, who was watching her with the simple attentiveness of a man who had not yet decided she was invisible. "Saturday mornings," she said, "if that suits you." "Saturday mornings suits me fine," he said. Nathaniel noticed in the way that men notice things they have willfully ignored for too long suddenly and too late, and with a disconcerting clarity. He noticed that Clara no longer waited for him at breakfast. He had grown accustomed to finding her at the table when he came down from the early morning fields, not because he wanted her there precisely, but because her presence had become a kind of weather he'd stopped registering. Then one morning in early August, he came in from the south field, and the table was empty, and Mrs. Harlan was putting his plate out with the air of a woman who had been expecting this moment. "Where is Mrs. Reed?" he asked. "Out, sir," Mrs. Harlan said in a tone that provided no further information. "Out where?" "The Eastern barn, I believe. She's got the Miller and Birch children in there for their letters this morning." Nathaniel sat down. He ate his breakfast. He told himself this was perfectly fine. Clara was organized and capable, and this was exactly the sort of household contribution a competent wife made. There was nothing unusual about it. He told himself this 3 times and did not quite believe it any of the 3. That evening he came to the parlor and found it empty. He found her at the writing desk in the small room off the East Hall, a room she had quietly claimed as her own sometime in the spring. He wasn't certain exactly when, with a stack of papers spread in front of her, and an ink-stained middle finger, and a concentration so complete she didn't hear him come in. He stood in the doorway. She was writing something, whispering the words slightly under her breath as she worked, and the lamplight was settling on her in a way that made something shift in his chest. Some piece of wall he had mortared into place years ago and stopped examining. "Clara," he said. She looked up, and there was something in her face he hadn't seen before or hadn't let himself see. Not the careful, hopeful expression she'd worn in the first months of their marriage. Not the silent endurance of the middle months. Something quieter and more settled, the face of a woman who has found her footing and no longer needs anyone else to hold her up. "Nathaniel," she said politely, "what are you working on?" "Letters for the tenant children. I'm making cards with the alphabet and simple words. Elias Carter has a method he's taught me, and it works well with the younger ones." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Carter," he said. "The schoolmaster. He's been helping on Saturday mornings." "I know who he is." Clara looked at him steadily. "Was there something you needed?" And that was when it landed on him, the full weight of it dropping without ceremony. "Was there something you needed?" Not "how are you," or "come in, sit down," or any of the warmth that she had once offered every time he walked into a room. Just a polite, measured, entirely appropriate inquiry. The kind you'd make of an acquaintance. She had stopped. He hadn't seen it happen. He hadn't watched her pull back one small act of self-protection at a time. He had simply looked up one August evening and found that the light he'd been taking for granted had quietly gone out. "No," he said. "Nothing. Good night, Clara." "Good night, Nathaniel," she said, and turned back to her letters. He stood in the hallway for a long moment after she'd looked away. Then he walked upstairs to his room and sat in the dark and did not sleep. The next Sunday at church, Reverend Mills made a point of speaking to Clara after the service, shaking her hand warmly and saying something that made her laugh. A real laugh, not the careful social kind. And Nathaniel, standing 8 feet away, talking to a tobacco merchant, watched his wife laugh, and felt something he could not immediately name claw up through his chest. On the way home in the carriage, he said, "You seem well." "I am well," she said. She was looking out the window at the July fields rolling past, and she said it the same way she'd said, "I'm perfectly fine," that night at the parlor window. Not as reassurance, not as report, just as simple fact. "The schoolwork seems to suit you," he said. "It does. The children are improving." "Della read a full sentence yesterday without any help," she said, and her voice warmed when she said it just briefly, just genuinely, the way it never quite warmed when she spoke to him anymore. Nathaniel stared at the floor of the carriage. "That is good," he said. "That is very good." Clara looked at him then for just a moment with an expression he could not read. Then she looked back out the window. They rode the rest of the way home in silence, and Nathaniel noticed for the first time that the silence was entirely his own. The Saturday morning sessions started with 6 children and grew to 11 by the end of August. Clara arranged them on old feed sacks in the eastern barn, the ones she'd had cleaned and restacked to make a proper sitting space. And she taught them the way Elias had shown her, starting with sound, not with sight, letting the letters come after the word had already lived in the mouth a while. Elias came every Saturday at 8 and stayed until noon, and in those 4 hours he and Clara worked with a quiet, efficient rhythm that felt to Clara like the first genuinely useful thing she had done since putting on a wedding ring. "Say it again," she told young Thomas Birch one morning, crouching beside him with the letter card in her hand. "Don't look at the card. Just say the word." "Water," said Thomas. "Good. Now look." He looked. Something clicked behind his eyes. "W," he said, pointing. "W is water." "W is water," Clara confirmed. From across the barn, Elias caught her eye and gave a small nod. The nod of a man who has taught enough children to recognize the exact moment the door opens, and Clara felt a satisfaction so clean and complete that for a few seconds she forgot entirely that her marriage was a beautiful wreck. That lasted until she got home and found Nathaniel standing in the front hall with a letter in his hand and an expression she couldn't quite read. "There's a social at the Pemberton estate next Saturday," he said. "All right," she said. "I'll need you to attend." She stopped. "Not will you come with me? Not I'd like you there. I'll need you to attend. Like a ledger entry. Like a household obligation." "Of course," she said, and walked past him to the stairs. He didn't call after her. The Pemberton social was everything Clara had learned to dread, arranged across 3 connected rooms of a house that had more mirrors than it had honest conversations. The women gathered near the back windows with their fans and their assessments, and the men collected near the drinks and talked tobacco prices and county politics, and Clara moved through it all with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent months learning to be decorative without being seen. Mrs. Pemberton herself was polite in the careful surface way of women who have decided another woman is beneath them but are too well bred to say so directly. "Mrs. Reed," she said, taking Clara's hand briefly. "How are you finding married life?" "Very well, thank you." "And Reed Hollow, a large property to manage for someone so young." "I manage," Clara said simply. Mrs. Pemberton's smile did not shift, but something behind it did. "Of course you do. Nathaniel always was efficient." Clara looked at her steadily. "He is," she said. "As am I." Mrs. Pemberton moved on to the next guest. Clara picked up a cup of cider she didn't want and positioned herself near the east window where she could see the whole room without being at its center. That was when Margaret Holt found her. Margaret Holt was the woman Abigail had dressed down at the mill, and she had the memory of someone who keeps accounts. She came with another woman Clara didn't know, younger, with sharp eyes and a practiced smile, and she said loud enough for 3 people nearby to hear, "Clara Whitaker. Or I suppose it's Reed now, isn't it? You've done well for yourself." "I've done all right," Clara said. "Nathaniel Reed." Margaret let the name sit in the air between them like a stone. "He's a serious man, isn't he? Not much given to, warmth." "He is serious," Clara agreed. "Reliable. Steady." Margaret glanced sideways at the younger woman beside her. Of course his first wife was the great beauty of the county, Eleanor Marsh. "Have you heard much about her?" Every muscle in Clara's body tightened, but she kept her face absolutely still. "Some," she said. "Tragic what happened. The baby and all." Margaret shook her head with a sympathy that didn't reach her eyes. "He grieved something terrible. The whole county felt it. Men like Nathaniel." She paused, delicate as a knife. "They don't really move on, do they? Not all the way." The younger woman beside her said nothing, but her eyes moved to Clara's face with the interested attention of someone watching to see where the blow would land. Clara set down her cup of cider. "Margaret," she said quietly, "I reckon you mean that to sting, and I reckon it does a little, but I also reckon a woman who spends this much energy on another woman's marriage might want to look a bit more carefully at her own." She picked up her cup again. "Give my regards to your husband." She walked away before Margaret could respond. Her hands were shaking slightly by the time she reached the other side of the room, but she kept them still at her sides and kept her chin level, and if anyone noticed, they were polite enough to say nothing. Elias Carter noticed. He appeared at her elbow without ceremony, the way he tended to not intruding, just arriving like something that had decided to be useful. "You all right?" he said low enough that only she could hear. "Perfectly fine. You've got the look of a woman who just won a fight she didn't want to be in." She glanced at him sideways. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone paying attention," he said. She looked across the room. Nathaniel was deep in conversation with Hector Graves and 2 other men near the fireplace, gesturing slightly with his cup at ease in the way he always was when the conversation was about land or commerce, or something that required nothing of his heart. "He didn't introduce me when we arrived," Clara said. She hadn't meant to say it aloud. Elias was quiet for a moment. "I noticed. He introduced Hector Graves to 3 different men within the first 10 minutes. She stopped. "I'm sorry. You don't need to hear this." "I don't mind hearing it," he said. "That's different from needing to." She looked at him. He was watching her with that simple, direct attention, the kind that didn't require anything from her in return. And she felt something in her chest shift, the way it does when a weight you've been carrying so long, you've forgotten. It's there as briefly unexpectedly lifted. "He married me for land," she said. It was the first time she had ever said it plainly out loud to another person. "I know," Elias said. "The whole county knows. But that's not what I see when I watch you work with those children on Saturday mornings." "What do you see?" "A woman who's decided what she's worth," he said, regardless of what the arrangement says. Clara said nothing for a long moment. Across the room, the fiddle player began to tune up, and the guests began the slow drift toward the space that had been cleared for dancing. Nathaniel crossed the room in that direction and passed Clara entirely without stopping. She watched him bow to Mrs. Graves, who was 60 if she was a day, and laughed like a horse, and take her hand for the opening reel, and she felt the full reality of her situation settle on her, like a stone settling into still water. Not dramatic, not violent, just final. She turned back to Elias. "Tell me about your time in the militia," she said. "I'd rather hear about something real." And he did. She stopped waiting for Nathaniel sometime in the first week of September, though she couldn't have named the precise moment. It wasn't a decision exactly, more like a recognition. The way you recognize finally that a door you've been knocking on for a year is not locked, but simply empty, and there is nothing behind it worth waiting for. She stopped looking toward the study when she passed it in the evenings. She stopped leaving his favorite reading lamp lit in the front room when he was working late. She stopped finding small reasons to walk past wherever he was in the house on the chance that he might speak to her. She stopped asking if he would join her for breakfast. She started taking breakfast in the small east room, where she kept her writing desk with a cup of coffee, and whatever she was currently reading, and she found that she did not miss the silence of eating across from him. Her own silence was different, inhabited hers, shaped around her own thoughts rather than around the constant effort of trying not to feel his indifference. Mrs. Harlan watched all of this without comment. One morning, she set a plate of biscuits on the desk beside Clara's coffee, without being asked, and Clara looked up and said, "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't," Mrs. Harlan said. "I'm all right." "Yes, ma'am," Mrs. Harlan said. "I can see that." She paused in the doorway. "For what it's worth, and I know it ain't much, I've watched a lot of women try to make a home in a house that wasn't ready for them. Most of them bent themselves so far out of shape trying to fit that they forgot what shape they started in." She looked at Clara steadily. "You haven't done that. I think that matters." Clara held the coffee cup in both hands and said nothing until her throat cleared. "Thank you, Mrs. Harlan," she said. "There's more biscuits if you want them," Mrs. Harlan said, and went back to the kitchen. Abigail came to find her on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-September, which meant something had happened because Abigail only came on Tuesdays when something had happened. She came into the East Room without knocking, which was her way, and sat down in the chair across the desk and said without preamble, "Nathaniel asked me if you were unhappy." Clara set down her pen. "He asked you," she said. "This morning. He came to my house, which he never does on a weekday, and he sat down and said, 'Abigail, is Clara unhappy?' And I looked at him for a long time before I answered." "What did you say?" "I said, 'Nathaniel, did you ask her?'" Abigail's voice was even but not gentle. "And he said he didn't know how. And I said, 'That is the most useless thing you have ever said to me, and I have known you for 26 years. Clara almost smiled. "He didn't know how," she said quietly. "He's frightened," Abigail said. "He has been frightened since Eleanor died, and he has been hiding behind competent and reliable and respectable, because those are things a man can be without opening himself up to being destroyed again." She leaned forward. "I am not telling you this to excuse him. I am telling you because I think you deserve to understand what you are actually dealing with." "I understand it," Clara said. "Abigail, I have understood it for months. His grief is real. His fear is real. And none of that changes what it has cost me to live inside it." "No," Abigail said quietly. "It doesn't. A man's wound does not give him the right to wound the person standing closest to him and call it grief instead of cruelty." Abigail looked at her for a long moment. "When did you get so clear-eyed about all this?" "When I stopped crying," Clara said simply. Abigail sat back. Something moved across her face. Respect, maybe, or something close to it. "What do you want, Clara?" she asked. "Not what do you need or what should he do. What do you want?" Clara thought about it honestly. "I want to be seen," she said. "I want to be introduced when we walk into a room. I want him to dance with me, or at least stand beside me in public instead of 2 rooms away. I want to speak and have him actually listen." She paused. "I want to not be a ghost in my own marriage." "That's not too much to ask," Abigail said. "No," said Clara. "It isn't, but I have stopped asking." She looked down at the papers on her desk. "I am done asking." Abigail left an hour later, and Clara went back to her letters. And that evening at supper, Nathaniel said, "I heard the schooling is going well," and Clara said, "It is," and passed him the bread, and the silence came back in, and neither of them said anything else for the rest of the meal. But Nathaniel ate slower than usual, and he didn't go to his study after. He sat at the table long after the plates were cleared, and Clara could feel him wanting to say something, the way you can feel weather changing before you see it, and she waited for 3 full minutes in perfect silence. Then she folded her napkin, said good night, and went upstairs. She did not look back. The harvest gathering at Graves Farm was the largest social event of the fall, which in Rockingham County meant roughly 140 people, 4 fiddle players, 2 competing punch bowls, and enough county gossip to last until Christmas. Nathaniel and Clara arrived together in the carriage, sat together for the opening supper, and that was the last moment they occupied the same 10 feet of earth for the next 3 hours. Clara watched it happen with the detached clarity of a woman who has finally stopped pretending not to see. He moved to the men. She stayed with the women. He worked the room with the comfortable authority of a respected landowner. A hand on a shoulder here, a well-timed laugh there, and she sat with Mrs. Graves and Mrs. Mills and listened to their talk about preserves and difficult pregnancies and the price of wool, and responded politely, and felt the whole evening sitting on her chest like something heavy and familiar. Margaret Holt was there, of course. She didn't approach Clara this time. She was smarter than that, or anyway more careful. But she stood with a cluster of women near the punch table, and Clara could see from the angle of their bodies, from the way one of them glanced toward her, and then quickly away, that she was being discussed. She could feel it the way you feel a draft from under a closed door. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply sat and smiled and responded and looked absolutely perfectly composed because she had learned that composure was the only armor that never rusted. That was when the fiddles started. She watched Nathaniel take the hand of Mrs. Pemberton for the first reel. She watched him lead Mrs. Hartley for the second. She watched him bow to the eldest Graves daughter, who was 16 and lovely, and laughed at everything for the third. She did not watch the fourth. She got up from her chair, walked to the far end of the room, stepped out through the back door into the warm September night, and stood on the Graves' porch, with her hands flat on the railing, and breathed through her nose until the burning in her eyes stopped. She heard the door open behind her. Mrs. Reed. Elias, she should have known. "I'm fine," she said before he could ask. "I know," he said. "You're always fine. You're the finest person in that room." She let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. He came to stand beside her, a respectful distance, looking out at the dark field beyond the fence line. After a moment, he said quietly, "He doesn't see what he's doing." "He sees," she said. "He simply doesn't think it matters." "You matter," Elias said. "Direct, simple, no performance in it." Clara gripped the railing. "Elias," she said carefully. "I know," he said. "I know what I'm saying, and I know what I'm not saying. I'm not saying anything improper. I'm saying that a woman who teaches 11 children their letters on Saturday mornings and nurses sick tenant families and holds her head up in a room full of people who are measuring her against a dead woman, that woman matters. Full stop." Clara turned to look at him. In the lamplight from the window, his face was honest and steady and completely without the agenda she'd half expected to find there. He wasn't trying to take something from her. He was just telling her the truth. "Thank you," she said. "You don't have to thank me for the truth," he said. "That's just courtesy." They stood there for another minute in the September night, the fiddles drifting out through the door between them, and then Clara straightened, smoothed her skirt, and said, "I'd better go back in." "Yes, ma'am," he said. She went back through the door. Nathaniel was standing just inside. She didn't know how long he had been there. She didn't know if he had heard through the door or seen through the window, or simply arrived at the wrong moment. But he was standing there with a glass in his hand and an expression she had never seen on his face. Something cracked open in it, something raw and unguarded, and almost frightened, and for one suspended second their eyes met. Then his face closed again. "Ready to leave?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." The carriage ride home was the most complete silence they had ever shared. Not the usual silence, not the comfortable on his side, devastating on hers quiet of their ordinary evenings. This one had weight and shape and edges. Nathaniel sat across from her in the dark and stared at the window, and Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap and stared at nothing, and the carriage moved through the warm September night with its lanterns swaying. He spoke first. "Carter," he said. "What about him? He seems—" He stopped, started again. "He seems very attentive." Clara looked at him in the dark. "He is a kind man," she said carefully. "He is helpful with the school. He treats me as though I have a mind worth listening to." She paused. "It's not a very high bar, Nathaniel." He said nothing. "I did not go out to that porch to be inappropriate," she said. "I went because I needed a moment of air." He followed to make sure I was all right. She kept her voice level. "Something I have been waiting for you to do for 11 months. The words landed. She felt them land. She felt the way he pulled in air through his nose slowly controlled the way he always controlled everything. "Clara, I'm not asking for an argument," she said. "I'm not even asking for an apology tonight. I'm simply telling you the truth because I think I've earned the right to say true things in my own carriage." He didn't answer. She looked back out the window. "I know what you lost," she said, quieter now. "Eleanor, the baby. I know that grief is real, and I would never diminish it, but your grief became my walls, Nathaniel. You built them around yourself, and I have been outside them since the day I arrived, and I am done. I am truly done, pressing my hands against them, hoping you'll feel it and let me in." The carriage stopped. Reed Hollow's front lights were visible through the window. Clara waited. Nathaniel said in a voice she had never heard from him, rougher, stripped of the control he wore like a coat, "I don't know how to stop." She looked at him. His face in the dim light was older than she usually let herself see, the grief worn into the lines of it, the fear behind the eyes of a man who had loved something and had it taken, and had spent years deciding that loving again was a risk no honest man could afford. She looked at him for a long time. "I know," she said at last, quietly. Not with warmth, but with the terrible fairness of a woman who understands something even when it is hurting her. "I know you don't, but not knowing how is not the same as not having to." She opened the carriage door herself. She went inside without waiting for him. Mrs. Harlan was still up moving in the kitchen, and she stopped when Clara came through and looked at her face and said nothing at all, which was exactly the right thing. Clara went upstairs. She sat at the small desk in her room and lit the lamp and picked up her pen and put it down again. Then she folded her arms on the desk and pressed her forehead against them and stayed like that for a long time, not crying, just breathing, just holding herself up in the dark. Outside, she heard Nathaniel come in. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, slower than usual, heavier, and she heard them stop outside her door. She lifted her head. She waited. His footsteps did not move for a full minute. Then they moved on. She heard his door close down the hall. She put her head back down. And the September night pressed in against the windows, warm and indifferent, and full of the sound of crickets, and Reed Hollow sat quiet on its land, and inside it, a marriage balanced on a knife edge between the last chance and the end of chances, and neither of them slept. Neither of them spoke about the carriage ride for 3 days. That was not unusual. Nathaniel had always been capable of extraordinary silences, the kind that stretched across rooms and meals, and whole weeks without breaking, the kind that a less determined woman might have mistaken for peace. Clara had stopped mistaking it. She knew by now that his silences were not peace. They were armor. And the longer he wore armor, the heavier it got for everyone standing near him. She went about her days. She taught on Saturday morning. She visited the Birch family on Monday, where the youngest boy had a fever that needed watching, and the Miller family on Wednesday, where the mother was 8 months along and exhausted and needed someone to sit with her and talk about something other than hardship. She managed the house stores with Mrs. Harlan, wrote letters for the county schooling committee, and read every evening in the small east room with the lamp turned up high against the shortening October days. She did not go looking for Nathaniel. She did not wonder where he was in the evenings. She did not wait. And somehow that the not waiting, the absolute settled completeness of it, unsettled him more than anything she might have said. She knew because Mrs. Harlan told her in the careful sideways way she had. "Mr. Reed asked after your schedule this morning," she said one afternoon, pulling a pie from the oven without looking up. "Wanted to know when you'd be home from the Miller place." Clara looked up from the household accounts. "What did you tell him?" "Told him I didn't rightly know," Mrs. Harlan said, "seeing as you don't generally give me a return time." She set the pie on the board. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a good long minute after that. "What did he do then?" "Went out to the fields," Mrs. Harlan said. "Same as always, just slower." Clara looked back down at the accounts. "Thank you, Mrs. Harlan," she said. "Pie'll be ready by supper," Mrs. Harlan said, which was not a response, but was somehow exactly the right thing to say. Abigail came that Thursday with news, and a face that said the news was not good. She came in through the kitchen door, which meant she had walked from her house rather than taken the carriage, which meant she had needed the walk to settle herself before she arrived. "Margaret Holt has been talking," she said, sitting down at the kitchen table without removing her bonnet. Clara kept shelling the beans in her lap. "She's always talking. This time it's different." Abigail's voice was flat and careful. "She's been saying, and she's been saying it to specific people, not just the general gossip pool, that you and Elias Carter have been meeting privately. That the Saturday school is an arrangement, not a charity." The bowl of beans went very still in Clara's lap. "She is saying," Clara said, keeping her voice level, "that I am conducting an affair in a barn full of children. She is implying it loudly enough that 3 women came to my parlor this week with concerned faces and delicate questions." Clara set the bowl on the table. "What did you tell them?" she said. "The truth," Abigail said. "That it was poison dressed as concern, and they ought to be ashamed of themselves for carrying it." She paused. "But Clara, what matters is whether Nathaniel has heard it." The air in the kitchen changed. "Has he?" Clara said. Abigail looked at her. "I don't know. I came to warn you before someone else decided to be helpful about it." Clara stood up. She walked to the window, though she wasn't looking at anything outside it. She pressed one hand flat against the wood of the frame and breathed. She had done nothing wrong. She knew that with the clean, complete certainty of a woman whose conscience was clear. Elias had been nothing but decent, careful, respectful, unfailingly appropriate. Every Saturday morning there were 11 children present. Every session had been conducted in full view of Mrs. Harlan or one of the tenant wives. There was nothing. There had never been anything. But she also knew that in a county like this one, in a time like this one, what a woman had actually done mattered far less than what people decided she'd done. And Margaret Holt was not a stupid woman. She had chosen her target and her timing with the precision of someone who had been waiting for a weapon. "I need to speak to Nathaniel," Clara said. "Yes," said Abigail. "You do." Died. She found him in the stable, which was where he went when he was thinking through something he couldn't solve at his desk. She had learned that in the same way she'd learned everything else about him quietly at a distance without his help. She came in, and he looked up from whatever he'd been doing with the bridle in his hands, and his face did the thing it had started doing lately, that involuntary tightening, that almost expression that came and went too fast to name. "We need to talk," she said. "Clara, Margaret Holt is telling people that my school sessions with Elias Carter are something other than what they are," she said, straight, no softening. "She is implying an impropriety. I want you to know directly from me that there has been none. The sessions are conducted in full view of witnesses every single time. He is a decent man and a professional schoolmaster, and I have done nothing that requires either explanation or apology." Nathaniel set the bridle down. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking, and she waited, standing in the middle of the stable, with her hands quiet at her sides, because she was done with the version of herself that braced for impact. "I know," he said finally. She blinked. "You know. I know you've done nothing wrong." His voice was rough, but steady. "I know what Carter is and what he isn't, and I know—" He stopped, pressed his jaw together. "I know that a man who leaves his wife alone in every room she walks into doesn't have the standing to question the character of the man who bothered to be decent to her." The words hit her differently than she'd expected, not with relief, with something raw. "Nathaniel, I heard what you said in the carriage," he said. "I've been hearing it for 3 days, and I don't know what to do with it yet. But I know you've done nothing wrong, and if Margaret Holt says otherwise to my face, I will correct her." Clara looked at him. "To her face," she said carefully. "Yes." "In public." He met her eyes. Yes. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she nodded. All right, she said. And she left because there was nothing else to say yet, and she had learned that pushing past the real thing a person had just offered you was how you lost it. The weather broke in the second week of October. Virginia autumns could be gentle or savage, and this one chose savage, a hard cold front that came down from the north and turned the roads to mud overnight and left the tenant families scrambling for extra stores and warmer bedding. Clara heard from Mrs. Harlan that the Kellerman family, newer tenants on the far western edge of Reedland, people she hadn't visited yet, had a child sick with something the mother couldn't identify and couldn't manage alone. She told Mrs. Harlan to pack a medicine kit. "Mr. Reed's in town," Mrs. Harlan said, not quite saying what she meant. "I know," Clara said. "I'll take James in the smaller carriage. We'll be back before dark." "The western road's bad," Mrs. Harlan said. "It'll hold," Clara said. It did not hold. The road gave out about a mile past the Kellerman cabin on the return trip, in the exact spot where the creek had been flooding its banks for a week without anyone thinking to reinforce the near edge. The front left wheel hit the soft ground at the wrong angle, and the carriage lurched hard to the left, and James, 17, steady enough in good conditions, yanked the horses short and managed to stop them before the whole thing went over, but the wheel had sunk and the carriage wasn't going anywhere on its own. Clara climbed out without being asked. She stood in the mud and assessed the situation with the calm of a woman who has learned that panic does not solve practical problems. "Can you get the horses clear?" she asked James. "Yes, ma'am, I think so." "Do that. Keep them steady. I'll look at the wheel." The wheel was bad. Not broken but buried to the hub in soft ground, and there was no good footing on the slope, and no way to lever it free without more hands than the two of them represented. The cold came in faster than she'd expected. She had her shawl, she had her gloves. She did not have a coat, because she had not planned to be standing in a muddy road at 4 in the afternoon with the October wind coming down off the mountain, like something with a purpose. "Someone will come," she told James, who was starting to look frightened in the way that 17-year-olds look frightened, trying hard not to show it, and therefore showing all of it. "Stay with the horses and stay calm." "Yes, ma'am," he said. She pressed her back against the carriage and crossed her arms over her chest and waited. Nathaniel got back to Reed Hollow just as the light was starting to go. He came in through the front, which meant Mrs. Harlan intercepted him before he'd gotten his coat off, which meant the look on her face was the first thing he saw. "Where is she?" he said before Mrs. Harlan had spoken. "Western Road," Mrs. Harlan said. "She went to the Kellerman place this morning. Should have been back 2 hours ago." The cold that moved through Nathaniel Reed had nothing to do with the weather. He turned around. "Which carriage?" he said. "The small one, James driving." "The Western Road's been soft for a week." "I told her that," Mrs. Harlan said. He was already back at the door. "Send someone to the Kellerman place to let them know," he said. "And if we're not back in 2 hours, send Thomas Birch to the county road." He didn't wait for her answer. He found them 40 minutes later just past the creek bend where the road went soft, the carriage listed sideways in the mud, and James standing by the horses with his hat in his hands. And Clara. Clara pressed against the carriage with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and her face pale, in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with cold. He rode up and was off the horse before it had fully stopped. "Clara." He said it differently than he usually said her name, like it mattered, like the sound of it had weight. She looked at him. "The wheel's in," she said, practical and steady. "We couldn't get it free. James has been good." "Are you hurt?" "No. Cold." He pulled off his coat and put it around her before she could object, and she started to say something, and he said, "Don't," in a voice that wasn't commanding, but was very close to desperate, and she stopped. He looked at the wheel. He looked at the road. He called James over, and the two of them worked the problem for 20 minutes using the saddle rope and the horse's leverage, and one good piece of fence rail they pulled from the nearby post, and they got the carriage free. James drove ahead to bring the carriage home. Nathaniel put Clara on his horse and walked alongside, and neither of them spoke until the lights of Reed Hollow were visible in the distance. Then Clara said quietly, "You should not have risked yourself for land." She said it without bitterness, just truth. Just the honest acknowledgement of what they both knew lay at the foundation of everything between them. Nathaniel stopped walking. He stood there in the dark October road with his hand on the horse's neck, and he looked up at her and said in a voice she had never heard from him before, stripped of everything, no control, no distance, nothing. "I did not come for land." The words sat in the air between them. Clara looked down at him from the horse. Her face was still pale. The coat he'd given her was too big, and the wind was pulling at her hair, and she looked in that moment like a woman who has been holding herself together through sheer force of will for so long that any one more true thing might undo her. "Then why?" she said. He put his hand over his mouth, pressed it there for a second, then dropped it. "Because I realized somewhere between the stable and that carriage ride 3 weeks ago that I have been a coward," he said. "And that my cowardice had a face, and it was yours." She said nothing. "I told myself I was being careful," he said. "I told myself that keeping distance was protection, that if I didn't, that if I let myself—" He stopped. Started again. "Eleanor died in February. The baby died 3 days after, and I decided somewhere in the following winter that love was a thing I had used up, that I had been given one chance at it, and I had failed to protect it, and that was the end of that." Clara's hands tightened on the saddle. "And then your father came to me with the land arrangement," he said, "and I thought a practical marriage, something clean, something I could manage without any of the parts that could be taken from me." He looked up at her. "I thought I was being honest with you. I told myself you knew what the arrangement was." "I did know," she said. "Yes." His voice was rough. "But I did not tell you that I was also arranging to make sure you could never get close enough to matter. And that was not honest. That was fear dressed up as terms." The horse shifted. Clara steadied it. "Your fear became my walls," she said. She had said it in the carriage weeks ago. She said it again now, not as accusation, but as simple fact, the way you state something that has been true for a long time and needs to be spoken plainly before it can be addressed. "I know," he said. "I spent 11 months pressing my hands against them. I know that too. And then I stopped," she said. "Not because I wanted to, because I couldn't keep spending myself on a man who had decided in advance that I couldn't reach him." He looked at her, and the grief in his face was so unguarded that it was almost hard to look at. Not the polished, managed grief of a respectable widower. The real thing, the shapeless, unresolved grief of a man who had locked a wound away so long he'd forgotten how much of himself he'd locked inside with it. "Clara," he said, "I don't know how to ask you to forgive something I am still only beginning to understand I did." She looked at him for a long, long moment. The October wind moved between them. "Then don't ask me yet," she said finally. "Take me home first." He took the horse's reins and walked, and she rode, and they went the rest of the way to Reed Hollow in silence. But it was a different silence than any they'd shared before. Not empty, not armored. Something in it that had never been there before, fragile and tentative, and entirely real. Tieh. She was running a slight fever by the time they got inside. Nothing serious. The cold and the waiting had gotten into her chest, and her skin was warm to the touch, and she was shivering under his coat, in a way that said her body had been working hard to keep itself right for longer than it should have had to. Mrs. Harlan took one look at her and sent everyone else out of the kitchen. Clara sat at the kitchen table with a blanket around her and her hands wrapped around a cup of something hot, and Mrs. Harlan moved around her with the brisk, tender efficiency of a woman who knows exactly how to take care of someone without making them feel cared for in the wrong way. Nathaniel stood in the kitchen doorway. "You should go," Mrs. Harlan said, not looking up. "I'd like to stay," he said. "She's fine. She needs warmth and rest, not company." Mrs. Harlan looked up then briefly with the expression of a woman who has seen everything this house has to offer over 19 years. "You can check in the morning." Nathaniel looked at Clara. Clara looked at him over the rim of her cup. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. He nodded once. "I'll check in the morning," he said, and left. Mrs. Harlan waited until his footsteps faded up the stairs. Then she refilled Clara's cup and set it back down without comment. "He came out after you in the dark," she said after a moment. "I know," Clara said. "Left that letter from the county commissioner sitting open on his desk and came straight out." "I know." Mrs. Harlan sat down across from her. This was unusual. Mrs. Harlan did not generally sit at the kitchen table in the evenings. Clara looked at her. "For what it's worth," Mrs. Harlan said, "and I know my opinion isn't what you're making decisions by. I've watched that man for 13 years, since before Eleanor. I know what he looks like when he doesn't care about something." She folded her hands on the table. "He doesn't look like that when he looks at you." Clara's throat tightened. "He has a strange way of showing it," she said. "He does," Mrs. Harlan agreed. "A very strange way. 19 years and I haven't seen him scared of much. But he's scared of you." She paused. "Not of who you are. Of what it means that he needs you." Clara looked down at the table. She was tired. The cold had gotten into her bones and her chest ached from shivering, and there were at least 4 things she needed to think through carefully that she did not have the energy to think through tonight. The anger was still there. Not gone, not dissolved by one moment in the dark road, not erased by one stripped-bare confession. Real damage didn't work that way. She knew that. She had always known that. But something had shifted. She couldn't have said exactly what or how far, but something had moved like a door that has been swollen shut for months, finally giving just slightly in its frame. Not open. Just no longer impossible. "Go to bed, Mrs. Harlan," she said gently. "I will when you do," Mrs. Harlan said unmoved. Clara finished her cup. Let the warmth of it settle through her. "He said I did not come for land," she said quietly, almost to herself. Mrs. Harlan was quiet for a moment. Then, "Did you believe him?" Clara thought about it honestly. Thought about his voice in that road, the way it had sounded with all the management stripped off it. The way he had moved off the horse before it stopped coat off, before she'd said a word, working the wheel in the mud for 20 minutes without complaint. "Yes," she said. "I believed him." "Well," said Mrs. Harlan, "but believing a thing and trusting it are not the same," Clara said. "And trust takes time," Mrs. Harlan said. "And proof. Yes, I know." She stood up. "Bed, both of us." Nathaniel knocked on her door the next morning at 7. She was already up, which surprised him, she could tell from the slight adjustment of his expression when she opened the door. She had the blanket around her shoulders still, and her hair loose, which was not how she generally presented herself. But it was 7 in the morning, and she had not been expecting to perform for anyone. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Better," she said. "The fever broke around midnight." He looked at her face. Checking. Actually checking the way a man checks when he's genuinely concerned, not the way he asks out of household management. "I'm fine," she said. Then, because old habits die slowly and she was still learning new ones. "Truly." He nodded. Then, "I want to speak to you, when you're ready. Not now, I can see you're not ready now, but today, if you're willing." "About what?" she asked. "About everything I should have said before now." She looked at him standing in the hallway outside her door. This careful, closed, grieving, frightened man, who had kept her outside his walls for 11 months, and had ridden into the dark to find her when it mattered, and she felt the contradiction of him with a clarity that was almost painful. "After breakfast," she said. "After breakfast," he agreed. She closed the door. She stood with her back against it for a moment, and pressed her hands flat against the wood, and felt her own heartbeat steady and real, and told herself the truth. She did not know what came next. She did not know if what he had to say would be enough, or if enough even existed. or if a marriage that had been built wrong could be rebuilt into something true. But she was willing to sit down and find out. That was more than she'd been willing to do 3 days ago. She pushed off the door and went to dress. Outside, the October morning was cold and clear, and Reed Hollow sat quiet on its land, and somewhere down the hall, Nathaniel Reed was sitting with everything he needed to say, and no idea yet whether he would be heard. He would be heard. But what happened after that was a thing neither of them could know yet, and the not knowing was, for the first time in this marriage, something that belonged to both of them equally. Breakfast was quiet in the way that matters not. The old silence, the one that had weight and absence in it, but something more careful, more deliberate, like two people who have agreed without saying so to be gentle with the next hour. Nathaniel poured her coffee himself. It was a small thing. He had never done it before. Mrs. Harlan always did it, or Clara did it herself, and the fact that he crossed the kitchen and picked up the pot and filled her cup before she reached for it without ceremony, without making it into a gesture, landed on her more squarely than any speech could have. She said nothing. She wrapped her hands around the cup and looked at the table. He sat down across from her. They ate. When the plates were cleared, and Mrs. Harlan had made herself absent in the way she did when she understood the room needed to be empty, Nathaniel folded his hands on the table and looked at Clara and said, "I'd like to tell you about Eleanor." Clara looked up. "You don't have to," she said. "I know I don't have to." He held her gaze. "That's why I want to." She nodded once. And waited. So, he talked for nearly an hour. He talked about Eleanor Marsh, the way people talk about someone they loved and lost, before the love had time to fully settle, with a reverence that had curdled slightly at the edges from too many years of guilt layered on top of grief. Eleanor had been warm and bright, and completely certain of everything, which had steadied him in a way he hadn't recognized as steadying until it was gone. She had been 7 months along when the fever came. It came fast, and it took her faster, and he had stood in that bedroom and watched the thing he had built his entire quiet future around dissolve in 3 days. The baby, a boy, had lived 3 days longer. "I held him," Nathaniel said. His voice was even. It had the evenness of a man who has told this story to himself so many times that he knows exactly where the raw places are and how to move around them. He was perfect. There was nothing wrong with him except that his mother was gone and he was too small to stay without her. He stopped. "I named him Thomas. Then I buried him beside her, and I came home, and I closed every door in this house, and I told myself that was the end of it." Clara said nothing. "I ran the land," he said. "I managed the estate. I kept every obligation, and I was respectable and productive, and I told myself that was a full life, that it was enough." He looked at his hands. "It was not enough, but it was safe. And I had decided that safe was what I was willing to settle for." "Until my father's debt," Clara said quietly. "Until your father's debt," he agreed. "And then I made the worst possible decision a man in my position could make." He looked up at her. "I told myself I was being honest by telling you it was an arrangement. What I was actually doing was building myself another wall and calling it fairness." Clara sat with that. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the October wind was working on the last of the leaves. "I can pity your grief, Nathaniel," she said at last. Her voice was steady and entirely without cruelty. "I do pity it. What you lost was real, and it was terrible, and any decent person would carry it." She paused. "But I will not live inside it. I will not spend the rest of my life being punished for a grief I did not cause and a fear I was never given the chance to help carry." He took that in without flinching. She gave him credit for that. "No," he said. "You shouldn't have to." "I need you to understand something," she said. "One conversation does not fix 11 months. One night on a muddy road does not undo what it cost me to stop hoping you would see me." She kept her voice level. "I am not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because if we are going to figure out what this marriage can actually be, we have to start from what's true, not from what's easier." He met her eyes. What would you need to start from what's true? She had thought about this. She had thought about it in the kitchen the night before, and again at 3 in the morning when she was lying awake with the tail end of the fever and a clarity that comes sometimes in the dark hours when everything else is quiet. Separate rooms, stay separate, she said. For now. That's not punishment, that's honesty. I need space that is mine while we figure this out. He nodded. No more public absence, she said. No more walking into a room together and spending the evening as strangers. If we arrive somewhere together, we leave together, and in between you remember that I exist. Yes, he said. And no more decisions about my life without my voice in them. The school, the tenants, how I spend my time. None of that gets decided over my head. She paused. I am not a piece of the property, Nathaniel. I am not the bottom land parcel. I am a person, and I will be treated as one. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said simply, You should have been treated as one from the start. I'm sorry. 3 words. I'm sorry. She had waited 11 months for them, and now that they were here, she found they did not fix anything. But they were real, and real was something she could work with. All right, she said. All right, he said. And they sat there at the kitchen table in the October morning, 2 people at the beginning of something that was not forgiveness yet, but was the road that led there, and neither of them pretended it was more than it was. The first test came sooner than either of them expected. It came in the form of Reverend Mills and the county schooling committee, who arrived at Reed Hollow 4 days after the kitchen conversation, with the careful apologetic faces of men who have been sent to deliver news. Someone else didn't want to deliver themselves. Nathaniel and Clara received them in the front parlor together. This was itself new. The together part. The fact that when Mrs. Harlan announced the visitors, Nathaniel came and stood beside Clara, rather than gesturing her toward the chairs and positioning himself at the desk like a man conducting business. Reverend Mills cleared his throat and said that the committee had concerns about the Eastern Barn School. Specifically, there were members of the county board who felt that educating tenant children, particularly certain tenant children, was a disruption to the natural order of labor and household management. There were concerns about what ideas might be introduced. There were concerns about precedent. He said all of this carefully looking mostly at Nathaniel. Nathaniel said, Clara. Reverend Mills blinked. Nathaniel looked at her. This is your school. What would you like to say to these men? Clara felt something in her chest shift. Not dramatically. Not with ceremony. Just a quiet, significant settling, like a stone finding its right place. She looked at Reverend Mills and she said, With respect, Reverend, the children in that barn are learning to read scripture. They are learning to count and measure and write their names. The ones who feared that would be disruptive to anything decent are the same ones who have been using ignorance as a management tool for 20 years, and I think we all know it. Silence. One of the other committee men shifted in his seat. Mrs. Reed, Mills said carefully, The concerns are that a woman is running something without asking permission, Clara said, and I understand that's uncomfortable for certain men, but the children's reading is not going to stop. She folded her hands in her lap. The question is whether the county committee would like to be the kind of men who supported it or the kind of men who tried to stop it. Both kinds end up in the historical record eventually. Reverend Mills looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked back at him with the expression of a man who has already made his decision and is simply waiting for the room to catch up. My wife has said what needs to be said, Nathaniel said. The school continues. If the committee has further concerns, they're welcome to put them in writing. The committee left 20 minutes later with a great deal of careful nodding and no firm commitments, which was the way county committees always left rooms when they had lost without wanting to admit it. The door had barely closed when Clara turned to Nathaniel. He was already looking at her. Thank you, she said. I didn't do anything, he said. You did it. I just made sure they looked at the right person. She studied him for a moment. There was no performance in it. No pride, no expectation of credit. Just the plain satisfaction of a man who had done the right thing and knew it. "It's a start," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "It is." Elias Carter came to her the following Saturday with the same steady punctuality he always had. But this time, he came with a different awareness of the house around him. She could feel it in the way he positioned himself, slightly more formal, slightly more deliberate, in the deference he showed the boundaries between them. She suspected Nathaniel had spoken to him. She didn't ask. After the children had gone home, and they were tidying the barn, Elias said without looking up from the stacking of letter cards, "I hear things have changed some at Reed Hollow." "Some things have changed," she said carefully. He nodded. "That's good." He paused. "I mean that without any agenda attached to it. It's just good." She looked at him. He was honest as he always was, clear-eyed and without self-pity. "Elias," she said. "I know," he said before she could continue. "I've always known what this was and what it wasn't. You needed someone to see you. I was glad to. That's the whole of it." He looked up. "Don't make it complicated on my account." She felt a genuine gratitude for him that had nothing romantic in it, just the clean, uncomplicated gratitude of a woman for a man who had been decent when decency was scarce. "You're a good man," she said. "Trying to be?" he said, and picked up the next stack of cards. November came in cold and fast, and with it came the first real test of what Nathaniel had said he would do differently. The county commissioner held a formal supper, 30 guests, 3 courses. The kind of event where every conversation was also a negotiation, and every seating arrangement was a statement. Nathaniel and Clara arrived in the large carriage this time, and he handed her down from it himself, and he walked beside her through the front door. And when Commissioner Hartley came to greet them, Nathaniel said before Hartley could address him, "Commissioner, I believe you know my wife. She's been running the tenant school on our eastern property. The committee's been hearing good things." Hartley blinked. "Mrs. Reed, of course. I had heard something about—" "She's doing remarkable work," Nathaniel said easily conversationally, the way a man says something he has known for a long time and has no uncertainty about. "The Miller boy read a full passage at church last week. His mother near cried." Hartley looked between them, recalibrating. "Well," he said. "Admirable, Mrs. Reed. Truly admirable." Clara smiled at him, and it was a real smile because something about being introduced properly publicly as a person with accomplishments worth noting filled a space that had been hollow in her for a very long time. Later at the supper table, Nathaniel was seated 2 places from her, and across the table, Margaret Holt was seated directly in Clara's line of sight, with an expression that had been carefully arranged into something neutral, but could not quite contain its own surprise. Clara held her gaze for exactly 1 second. Then she turned to the woman beside her and asked a genuine question about the woman's garden, and didn't look at Margaret again. When the dancing started after supper, Nathaniel crossed the room. He stopped in front of her. He held out his hand. She looked at it, then up at him. "I reckon I'm about 2 months overdue," he said quietly. She took his hand. They danced. It was not a perfect dance. He was slightly stiff, and she was slightly careful, and they were both too aware of the room watching them for it to be fully natural. But it was real, and it was public, and when the music ended, he didn't drop her hand immediately. He held it for 1 extra beat long enough to mean something before he released it. Across the room she saw Abigail watching with an expression she had never seen on Abigail's face before. Something soft and almost undone. Clara looked away before either of them started crying. The real twist came 3 days after the commissioner's supper, and it came in the form of a letter. It came addressed to Clara, which was already unusual. Most of the Reed household correspondence arrived, addressed to Nathaniel. It came from a man named Alderman Cross, a lawyer in Richmond, and it was written in the careful formal language of a man who has information he has been sitting on for some time and has finally decided to deliver. Clara read it twice at the writing desk. Then she sat for a long while without moving. Then she brought it to Nathaniel. She set it on his desk and stood back. He picked it up, read it. She watched his face. The letter said this: Thomas Whitaker, her father, had mortgaged the bottomland parcel before the debt to Nathaniel was ever arranged. He had mortgaged it to a land company out of Richmond 9 months before the marriage, which meant that Nathaniel had not actually acquired clear title to it, could not acquire clear title to it through the marriage arrangement. The debt had been real. The land transfer had been structurally flawed from the start, which meant the letter said that the legal basis for the arrangement itself was not what either party had been told it was. Nathaniel set the letter down. He said nothing for a long moment. Clara watched him. "Did you know?" he said. "No." She said it flatly and honestly. "My father told me nothing about a mortgage. I knew about the debt. I did not know about that." He believed her. She could see it, not the deliberate choosing to believe her, but the immediate instinctive recognition of truth that comes when you actually know a person. "Your father," he began. "My father was a desperate man," she said. "I am not going to defend what he did. It was dishonest, and it put me in an impossible position, and I am furious about it." She stopped, took a breath. "But I want to be very clear about something. Whatever the legal basis of this marriage was, or wasn't, what has happened between us in this house, the 11 months of it, the conversations, the cost of it, the carriage ride, the kitchen table, none of that was arranged by a lawyer. None of that came from a land parcel. That was real. For better or for worse, all of it was real." He stood up. He came around the desk and stood in front of her closer than he usually stood, and looked at her face with the focus of a man who has spent too long not looking and is now trying to make up for lost time. "I don't want the land," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to know if you will stay," he said. "Not because of the arrangement, not because of what's legal or what the county expects. I want to know if you, Clara Whitaker Reed, will stay in this house with me because you choose to, because there is something here worth staying for." She looked at him. There it was. No armor, no management, no distance dressed up as dignity. Just a man standing in front of the woman he had failed and asking plainly if she would give him the chance to be different. She thought about the kitchen table and the coffee cup. She thought about the committeemen in the parlor, and the way he'd said, "My wife has said what needs to be said." She thought about his hand held out to her on the dance floor and the extra beat before he'd released it. She thought about the road. "I did not come for land." "I'll stay," she said. "But Nathaniel, I need you to understand that staying is not the same as surrendering. I am not going back to invisible. I am not going back to being a guest in my own house." She kept her eyes on his. "If I stay as myself. Fully. The school, the tenants, the opinions, the inconvenient truths, all of it. You take the whole person, or we figure out something else." "The whole person," he said without hesitation. She searched his face. "I will make mistakes," he said. "I will close up at the wrong moments, and say the wrong things, and probably revert to silence when I should speak. I'm telling you that plainly because you deserve honesty, more than you deserve promises I can't guarantee." He paused. "But I will try. Every day. And I will not disappear on you again." She was quiet for a long moment. "I have conditions," she said. "Name them." "The school gets a proper building. Not the barn, a real room with proper light on Reed land." "Done." "I manage the household accounts jointly, not as your assistant, as your equal." "Done." "And when someone in this county says something cruel about me, or about the school, or about any decision I make that you have approved, you correct them. Out loud. In front of people, not later in private where it counts for nothing." He held her gaze. "I will correct them," he said. "You have my word." She nodded slowly. The letter was still on the desk between them. The legal complexity of it, the months it would take to untangle her father's dishonesty, the Richmond lawyers and the land company, and all the paperwork of a marriage built on a flawed foundation. All of that was still there waiting. But it was no longer the point. "I'll write to Alderman Cross tomorrow," she said. "I'll write with you," he said. "Both our names on it." She picked up the letter and folded it and held it in her hand. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes, I forgive you." She said it plainly, without drama, the way you say something that has been true for a moment before you are ready to say it and is now simply ready. I forgive you. Not because everything is resolved, not because the hurt is gone, but because carrying it is heavy, and I would rather put it down and see what we can build without it." She paused. "But forgiveness is not a door I walk through, and everything is different on the other side. It's a road, and we're going to walk it for a while before we know where it leads." He looked at her with that rawness she had first seen on the muddy October road, the face underneath the face, the man underneath the armor. "A road," he said. "A road," she confirmed. He nodded. She went back to her writing desk. He went back to his, and Reed Hollow settled around them the October afternoon, pressing in at the windows. The house not quite the same house it had been that morning, and neither of them quite the same people. And outside, the last of the autumn leaves came down from the old oak by the fence line, one at a time, without hurry, the way things fall when they are finally ready to let go. The letter to Alderman Cross went out the following Monday, signed by both of them. It was a small thing on the surface. 2 names on a piece of paper, a legal correspondence about a land parcel and a flawed arrangement, and a Richmond mortgage that Thomas Whitaker had never disclosed. But Clara folded the sealed letter and handed it to James for the post, and felt in the weight of that folded paper something she had not felt in this house before. Not relief exactly. Something steadier than that. The feeling of standing on ground that belongs to you. Nathaniel watched her hand the letter over. He said nothing. He didn't need to. They were learning, both of them, which words were necessary and which ones were just noise filling the space where trust had not yet grown strong enough to hold silence comfortably. It was slow work. Real things always are. She moved back into the larger bedroom at the end of November. She did not make an announcement about it. She simply asked Mrs. Harlan to help her move her writing things to the desk near the east window, and Mrs. Harlan did it without a word. And that evening, when Nathaniel came upstairs and saw the lamp lit in the room they had never shared, and Clara sitting at the desk with a book in her lap, he stopped in the doorway. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. He came in. He sat in the chair near the fire. He picked up the almanac that had been sitting on the side table for 3 months, and opened it and read, and she read, and the fire worked through the wood, and the November wind moved outside the windows, and Reed Hollow held them both in a quiet that was for the first time genuinely quiet. December brought the first real proof of change, and it came from a direction neither of them expected. Thomas Whitaker arrived at Reed Hollow on a Wednesday morning without warning. Which was, Clara thought, precisely how a man arrives when he knows he will not be welcomed if he announces himself first. She heard the horses from the east room, and came downstairs to find her father standing in the front hall with his hat in his hands, and the particular expression of a man who has been rehearsing a speech for so long it has stopped sounding real. He was thinner than she remembered, older. The debt and its consequences had taken something from him that she was not sure could be given back. "Clara," he said. "Papa," she said. She did not move to embrace him. She stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at him steadily, and he looked back at her with the eyes of a man who sees for the first time what his decisions have cost another person. "I heard about the Richmond letter," he said, "about Cross and the mortgage." "Then you know we know," she said. "I should have told you." His voice cracked slightly at the edges. "I should have told Nathaniel. I should have told everyone before the arrangement was ever made. I was frightened, Clara. I was going to lose everything, and I made a choice that was not mine to make." "No," she said. "It wasn't." He pressed his hat brim between his hands. "I put you in a marriage built on a lie. I put you in a man's house as a settlement for a debt that wasn't even clean." He looked at her. "I am sorry. I don't know what else to say except that." Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about everything those words covered. The wedding ring heavy as iron. 11 months of being invisible. The harvest supper and Margaret Holt, and the way she'd learned to stop crying in April because the crying wasn't solving anything. All of it traceable back to this man standing in the front hall with his hat in his hands. "You can stay for supper," she said at last. He blinked. "Clara, I'm not forgiving you today," she said plainly. "That's going to take longer than a Wednesday morning. But you're my father, and you're standing in my house, and I was raised to offer supper." She paused. "Nathaniel will be in from the Southfield by 4. He swallowed hard. "I don't know if Nathaniel will want—" "I will handle Nathaniel," she said in a tone that left no room for discussion. Her father nodded. Something in his face shifted, not quite relief, not quite hope, but the recognition of something he had not expected to find. His daughter standing in her own home, managing her own situation with the quiet authority of a woman who had built that authority herself. "You've changed," he said softly. "I grew up," she said. "I just did it faster than either of us planned." Nathaniel handled it better than she'd expected, and worse than she'd hoped. Which was, she was learning his general operating mode when the territory was emotionally complicated. He shook Thomas Whitaker's hand at the supper table with a grip that was civil and nothing more, and he sat through the meal with a jaw set at an angle she recognized as controlled restraint, and he said perhaps 15 words over the course of an hour. Afterward, when Thomas had gone to the guest room, Mrs. Harlan had prepared and the house had settled. Nathaniel came to find her in the east room. "You should have warned me," he said. "I know," she said. "I didn't have time, and I also thought—" She stopped. "Honest. I thought if I warned you, you would close up and make the evening worse for everyone, including yourself." He looked at her for a long moment. "You were right," he said, which surprised her enough that she looked up. I would have. I would have spent all morning building walls instead of just sitting with it." He sat down. "He's a coward. What he did to you was wrong." "Yes. But he's your father." "Yes. And you're going to forgive him eventually." She thought about it honestly. "Probably," she said. "Not yet, but probably." Nathaniel nodded. "Then I will be civil," he said. "Not for his sake. For yours." She looked at him across the room, this careful, difficult, genuinely trying man, and felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Not the cautious, rationed feeling she'd been allowing since the kitchen table conversation. Something warmer and less controlled. "That is exactly the right thing to say," she said. "I have occasional moments," he said, and it was so close to dry humor, so close to the man she suspected had always been somewhere underneath the grief and the walls that she laughed. Really laughed. The kind that surprised her. He looked startled. Then something softened in his face so completely that she had to look away. "Occasional moments," she said, still smiling. "I'll take them." The schoolhouse went up in January. Nathaniel hired 2 men from the county, and they worked through 3 weeks of cold to get the frame and walls up on the eastern corner of Reedland, on the site of the old tobacco barn they cleared in November. It was small, 1 room, 6 windows, a proper wood stove, and enough space for 20 children if they didn't mind being close. Clara designed the interior herself and argued with the carpenter about the placement of the stove until the carpenter gave in, which Mrs. Harlan said was the most competent thing she'd seen done in this county in 10 years. On the morning the last window was set, Clara stood inside the empty room with the cold winter light coming in and her breath making small clouds, and she pressed her hand flat against the new wood of the wall and said nothing. Nathaniel came in behind her. He stood beside her and looked at what they had built and said, "It's a real school." "It's a real school," she agreed. "The county committee is going to have opinions. The county committee can write them down and send them to me," she said. "I'll respond when I have time." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the room with something in his face she recognized, now the look of a man who is proud of something and doesn't quite know how to carry it without dropping it. "Nathaniel," she said. Thank you." He looked at her. "Don't thank me. It's your school. I just paid the carpenter." "You argued with the county committee on my behalf," she said. "You signed the cross letter with me." You stood in that supper room last month and introduced me to Hartley before he could introduce himself to you." She kept her voice steady. "You are not the man who stood in the parlor and told me I'd missed supper like I was a piece of misplaced inventory. You are different, and I want you to know I see that, because you spent a long time not being seen either, and I know what that costs." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "I wasted a year," he said. "We wasted a year," she said. "Both of us in our different ways." She turned to face him. "But we're not wasting today." He looked at her, and for a moment, just a moment, the last of the distance between them closed. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just the way things close when they're finally ready. He reached out and took her hand. Just that. Her hand in his, standing in the empty schoolroom in the January light. She let him hold it. And that was enough for now. That was exactly enough. The schoolhouse opened in February with 14 children and Elias Carter teaching Tuesday through Friday and Clara teaching Monday mornings and Saturday afternoons. The county committee sent 2 observers for the first week, which Clara treated with cheerful, impenetrable hospitality. She gave them coffee and good seats and completely ignored them while she taught, and by the end of the second session they had stopped coming, which she took as a victory of the most satisfying kind. Word traveled the way things travel in a county where everyone is connected by 3 degrees of debt and 1 degree of church. The Miller boy who had read at church. The Birch children who were writing their full names. The Kellerman girl 8 years old, the one Clara had gone out to check on the day of the road incident, who could now read a full chapter of the Bible aloud without stopping. Women started coming to Clara. Not the Margaret Holts of the county. Not the ones who had spent a year measuring her against Eleanor Marsh and finding her insufficient. The other women. The ones who had been watching quietly from the outside of those same social circles. The ones who had their own small dignities to protect their own invisible walls to live inside. They came with questions about the school and stayed to talk about other things. About their husbands and their households and the narrow dimensions of a life in 1816 Virginia when you happened to be female. Clara listened and answered honestly, and did not pretend the answers were easy, and they came back. Abigail watched all of it with quiet satisfaction, and said nothing until one afternoon in March when she found Clara in the schoolhouse, after the children had gone rearranging the bookshelf that had been donated by the county minister with the slightly apologetic air of a man making partial amends. "You know," Abigail said, sitting on one of the small benches, with the particular carelessness of a woman who has never concerned herself much with propriety. When Nathaniel told Father he was marrying Thomas Whitaker's daughter, Father said he was making a practical decision, and that was all that could be expected of him. Clara kept rearranging books. "I know. I thought so too, if I'm honest." Abigail paused. "I thought he'd found a sensible arrangement and you'd both make the best of it and it would be fine in the way that things are fine when they're not especially bad." "That's more or less what I thought," Clara said. "And now you've built a school," Abigail said, "and my brother dances with you in public and argues with county commissioners and comes in from the Southfield early on Monday mornings because he knows that's when you teach and he likes to be in the house when you're in it." Clara stopped rearranging books. She turned and looked at Abigail. "He does?" she said. Abigail smiled. "Mrs. Harlan told me. She finds it very touching. She has opinions about most things, as you've discovered." Clara looked at the shelf for a moment. Then she laughed softly. A private laugh, the kind you have when something small turns out to be exactly the right size. "I didn't know that," she said. "Now you do," Abigail said. "Don't tell him I told you. He'd be insufferable about being caught at something sentimental." The public reckoning came in April, and it arrived with all the grace of a thrown stone. The Spring County Gathering was the largest social event since the Harvest Supper, the kind of occasion that drew every notable family in Rockingham County, and at least half the notable families from the surrounding ones. Nathaniel and Clara arrived together, walked in together, stood together for the opening formalities. This was unremarkable now. This was simply how they arrived places. What was remarkable was what happened 2 hours in. A man named Richard Forsyth, who owned a substantial tobacco operation east of the county line and had opinions about most things that hadn't asked for them, had been drinking since before supper and had reached the particular stage of confidence that turns small men into loud ones. He was standing near the drinks table with a cluster of men that included Hector Graves and two others Clara didn't know, and his voice carried across the room in the way voices do when they've stopped caring about who hears. "What I can't figure," Forsyth was saying, "is why a man like Reed lets his wife run around the county playing schoolmistress like she's got opinions worth hearing. My father would have—" He didn't finish the sentence, because Nathaniel had crossed the room. Clara felt the moment before she saw it. Felt the shift in the air, the way the cluster of men near Forsyth suddenly straightened the way Hector Graves took one small step sideways, with the instinct of a man who wants to be visibly not involved. Nathaniel stopped directly in front of Forsyth. He was not a small man. He had never needed his size because he had always had the kind of presence that made it unnecessary. He had the bearing of a man who is entirely certain of where he stands, and he used it now without performance, without anger, without raising his voice. "Say that again," he said quietly. Forsyth blinked. The confidence sagged at the edges. "I was only saying, I know what you were saying." Nathaniel's voice was level-controlled, and entirely without the warmth he'd been slowly learning to show Clara. This was the other register, the one that had run a large estate through a difficult decade without apology. "Say it again so the room is clear on what you mean." Forsyth said nothing. The room had gone. Not silent, there was still music, still the low murmur of other conversations, but the conversations near them had thinned to nothing, and the people close enough to hear were not pretending they weren't listening. "My wife," Nathaniel said, and the word came out differently than it ever had before, with a weight and a pride that were not performed for the room, but were simply true, "has built a school on Reed land that is teaching 23 children their letters and their numbers and their scripture. She has done it without asking the county's permission, without asking mine, and without the approval of men who fear what an educated woman might say to them when she finally has the words for it." He paused. "My wife has more courage in one ordinary Tuesday morning than any man in this county who is frightened of her opinions. And I will not stand in a room and hear her spoken of as though she is something I tolerate rather than someone I respect." Forsyth opened his mouth. "We're done," Nathaniel said, and turned away. The room rearranged itself around the moment the way rooms do. People finding new conversations, new directions, the surface of the social event, healing over the disruption. But not before Clara, standing 12 feet away, with Abigail's hand suddenly gripping her arm, had seen every word of it. Not before Margaret Holt, standing near the far wall, had seen every word of it. Not before Reverend Mills, who had watched the whole thing with the expression of a man revising his opinions in real time, had seen every word of it. Nathaniel walked back across the room to where Clara stood. He came up beside her, not in front of her, beside her the way a partner stands, and looked at her face and said quietly, "Are you all right?" She looked at him. She looked at this man who had married her for land and spent a year failing to see her and ridden into the dark to find her, and sat at a kitchen table and learned slowly, painfully, imperfectly how to be different. This man who had just stood in front of a room full of his peers and said her name like it meant something. "Yes," she said. Her voice was steady. "I'm all right." "I meant what I said," he told her. "I know," she said. That's why it worked. Abigail made a sound beside her that was definitely not crying. "I need more punch," Abigail said, and removed herself with dignity. The drive home was nothing like the October carriage ride. No silence, no armor, no two people sitting in the dark wondering if they'd run out of chances. They talked about Forsyth and the expression on Hector Graves's face, and whether Reverend Mills would mention it at the next committee meeting, and what Mrs. Harlan was going to say when she heard about it, which she would, because Mrs. Harlan always heard about everything within 48 hours. Clara was still smiling when they came up the lane to Reed Hollow. It was raining. Not the violent summer storm of her first months in this house. a softer rain, the kind that comes off Virginia mountains in April and settles into the ground like a promise. She heard it on the carriage roof as they pulled up, heard it stepping down from the carriage, heard it following them through the front door. Mrs. Harlan was already asleep. The house was quiet. Nathaniel lit the front room lamp and Clara unpinned her hair, and they stood for a moment in the comfortable quiet of two people who have stopped needing to fill the space between them with noise. Then Clara walked to the tall parlor window. She stood there watching the rain come down in the darkness, and she thought about the woman who had stood in this same spot 11 months ago with a wedding ring heavy as iron and a heart pressed small with the effort of being invisible. She thought about what that woman had wanted, and what she'd settled for, and what she'd finally refused to settle for anymore. She heard Nathaniel cross the room. He came and stood beside her, not behind her, not at the study door, not 2 rooms away in the comfortable management of his grief. Beside her. His shoulder 6 inches from hers, both of them looking out at the April rain moving through the darkness over Reedland. "I used to stand here alone," she said. "I know," he said. "I saw you. I was too afraid to come stand with you." She looked at him sideways. "And now," she said. He looked at her. "Now I reckon I'll come stand with you every time you'll let me." She looked back out at the rain. She thought about forgiveness and what it cost and what it was worth and how it felt finally to have put the weight of it down and found that she could breathe more easily without it. She thought about the schoolhouse and the children and Della reading her first full sentence and Thomas Birch pointing at the letter card and saying, "W is water," like it was the finest thing he'd ever discovered. She thought about what it meant to build something real in the middle of something that started wrong. "I want you to know something," she said. "All right. I am not staying in this house because I have nowhere else to go," she said. "I am not staying because of what the county expects or what's legal, or because my father's debt made me a bride, and I don't know how to be anything else." She turned to face him fully. "I am staying because I choose to. Because what you are becoming is something worth staying for. And because I have decided that my life here is mine, not arranged, not assigned, not settled mine. And I want to build it with you." Nathaniel looked at her for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, and without any of the management he had once wrapped around everything true. "Clara," he said, "I have been a fool and a coward, and I have cost you a year I cannot give back. But I promise you, for whatever my promises are worth to you right now, that I will spend every year after this one earning the right to stand beside you." He paused. "Not in front of you, not behind you, beside you, as your equal, as your partner, as the man who should have seen you from the very first day." She held his gaze. Then she reached out and took his hand the same way he had taken hers in the schoolroom in January, just that nothing more complicated than that, and turned back to the window. They stood there together in the lamplight, watching the April rain come down over Reed Hollow, and neither of them needed to say anything else. The school would open again on Monday. The county committee would write their letters, and Clara would answer them on her own time. Thomas Whitaker's mortgage would take another 6 months to untangle in Richmond, and when it did, the land would be managed differently, and the tenant families would have a better arrangement, and Della would be teaching the younger children herself by summer. Abigail would come to dinner on Sundays and argue about everything, and be right about half of it, and Precious about none of it. Mrs. Harlan would continue to know everything approximately 48 hours before anyone told her, and Clara Reed would stand in her own house on her own terms, with her own name worn the way she had chosen to wear it. Not as a settlement, not as an arrangement, not as the quieter end of someone else's grief, but as a woman who had decided in the middle of a year that tried hard to unmake her exactly who she was and what she was worth. She had not waited for a man to tell her. She had not needed one to. She had simply refused to disappear, and in the refusing, she had